Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Business of Sports.
The business of sports can be intimidating or hard for a startup to break into.
We really appreciate when our owners are actually there, with us through the journey.
Teams, ours especially, have been very intentional to diversify at all levels of the company.
I think we're in the golden years for the NFL and college football.
Our demographic reach has continued to expand.
This is going to be really unlocking the streaming platform for sports fans.
Sports valuations are rising. We'll see when they peak.
You don't have to be the best in your sport to make a whole ton of money.
Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio. Hello, this is the Bloomberg Business of Sports show where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Michael Barr.
I'm Scarlet.
And I'm Damian Sassower.
Coming up on the show, the NCAA looks on the way to settling a big revenue-sharing deal with all of its major conferences. We'll dive into that with former TD Ameritrade CEO and former college football head coach Joe Moglia.
Yeah, I think like everything else, everything is pretty much driven by money the vast majority of the time. And I think this really does a decent job of at least initially addressing the money. So by agreeing to a $2.7 billion settlement, I think the reason why people are potentially agreeing with that or are agreeing with that is because they're trying to avoid a $20 billion liability down the road.
Plus, we'll talk with a friend of the show, Bloomberg Originals chief correspondent Jason Kelly, about the latest episode of The Deal with Alex Rodriguez. And Jason Kelly this week featuring A-Rod's Minnesota Timberwolves co-owner Marc Lore. All that on the way on the Bloomberg Business of Sports. But first, the NFL is close to letting private equity firms buy stakes in teams. And once that happens, there's one Super Bowl winning quarterback who wants in, Eli Manning.
Pressure from Thomas off the edge. Eli Manning stays on his feet, airs it out down the field. It is caught by Tyree.
Bloomberg News Florida correspondent Anna Kaiser has done some great reporting on this, and she's here now to take us through it. Anna, welcome to the Bloomberg Business of Sports.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. This is something that first has got to start with the league saying, hey, we want to do this, and Eli is hoping, yes, please. So can you take us through that?
Yeah, so earlier in May, the NFL has proposed or is at least exploring the idea of having private equity come into the league. They're kind of the last holdout for professional sports teams. There's a lot of private equity ownership in the NBA and Major League Baseball. So the NFL is exploring that as well. They're saying that I think 30% of a team can be owned by private equity or institutional capital, and about 10% can be owned by an individual firm. So then enters Eli Manning, who is part of a private equity firm called Brand Velocity Group. I spoke with them a couple weeks ago and asked them about this new development, and they immediately said, yes, we're definitely interested in doing something like that. It's really exciting news. It's going to be a really interesting year for the NFL if they do allow private equity. So it seems something like they're really eager about.
They're really eager about it, and Brand Velocity, which is the PE firm that Eli Manning is a partner and co-founder of, is obviously very interested in an NFL franchise. What exactly did Eli Manning say? I mean, I know that it's not a surprise that a lot of private equity firms would want to be part of the most profitable professional sports league in the U.S. and if not the world. But, obviously when you attach Eli Manning to the NFL and ownership, that's going to get a lot of eyeballs.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think for him, it would obviously be a very exciting sort of feather in his cap in terms of investing because, he's so personally tied to the NFL. He said he was just really excited about it and that it was a really good opportunity. He hopes that it creates a better fan experience, that it just improves the league. He also spoke about just how much that's changed in the league with among players, that players are getting so involved in investing in the league itself, sometimes when they're still even playing professionally. So he said when he started in the NFL, like in the early 2000s, people never talked about that. It was like, you're an athlete, stay in your lane, keep it to the professionals. And now that's really, really changed. And he said that was just a big evolution from when he first started.
So, Anna, what comes to my mind here, and look, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that private equity is buying into the NFL or that they're even discussing it. But, from where I sit, is I'm looking at a headline here. I'm looking at Serie A. I'm looking at Inter Milan, the reigning champion of Serie A. And I'm looking at Oak Tree seizing control from a Chinese owner who couldn't pay their 400 million euro loan. And, I get the sense that, is there a risk that, once you get some of these private equity funds in there who may, they're very profit oriented, that you may see a lot more activity, buying up stakes, selling stakes, guys who can't pay their loans, just, a lot more movement on the ownership side. And I wonder if that's good for the game. I'm curious to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, I mean, that could be hard to say. Eli said something about, I really do hope that this is a good change for the league, but obviously there is some skepticism there. Up to 30% of a team being owned by institutional capital is a pretty, it's a big amount of an NFL team, and NFL teams are extremely valuable. It's the most valuable sports league in the country. So, it definitely might change the game as private equity ownership has changed, a lot of things. It changes companies when they acquire a company. So you're going to expect to see some changes. And
so, Anna, let me jump in here. I'm curious because as the Florida correspondent for Bloomberg News, you obviously cover the industries that are leading the way in Florida that matter the most. And of course, a lot of that has to do with property. It has to do with entertainment. And increasingly, it has to do with sports as well. You think about the Miami Football Club that David Beckham is invested in.
Leo Messi.
Yes, Lionel Messi. And of course,
Miami Grand Prix.
Miami Grand Prix. Thank you, Damian. And of course, the Miami Dolphins with Stephen Ross as the big owner there. And the Florida Panthers making it to the conference finals in the NHL. Like, Florida is a big, big sports town. And I'm wondering what you've observed when it comes to money and sports in Florida.
Oh, there is so much buzz around sports in Florida right now. The big headline obviously being Leo Messi coming to live in Miami and play in Miami was a huge surprise. I mean, no one thought that Messi would ever play in the United States. And there is a huge Argentine population here in South Florida. I live in a very Argentinian neighborhood, and it went crazy during the World Cup. So to have their idol, living in Miami, you see his face everywhere now. In terms of just merchandise opportunities, I don't think I ever really saw people wearing Inter Miami jerseys. Now, every kid is wearing that black and pink Inter Miami jersey, Messi's name on the back. So there's a ton of buzz around that. Formula One is obviously a huge weekend. For those of us who live here, also is a huge weekend for traffic and very high prices. But yeah, very big, splashy event that the city, has done a lot to attract and make into what it is. And yeah, the Dolphins, a lot of buzz around them. They did very well last season and then kind of puttered out. So I know that there's a lot of hope around them.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about the Miami Dolphins on this show. So let me ask you one more question.
A lot of bias there, Damian.
And, let's circle back to Eli Manning here and Brand Velocity Group. And I'm curious, in your article, what role, is Brand Velocity looking to play in terms of, are they a facilitator? Are they looking to co-invest alongside private equity? Are they, performing a financial advisory role? What do you envision the role of Eli Manning in, buying back into the NFL from an ownership perspective?
Yeah, I can tell you that that Brand Velocity Group, they say that they are, very active investors. They get very involved with the brands. I don't know how that would work with the NFL because that's such an established institution. How much could they really come in and change things, especially with only a 10% ownership. But, they think that they're really well positioned to make at least some, changes, improvements in NFL teams because they have a focus in sports, because they have, Eli Manning as a partner. So I know that they're hoping to be, pretty active in that investment, but we'll see how that really plays out.
All right, Anna, really appreciate your joining us today. Anna Kaiser, Bloomberg's Florida correspondent, joining us to talk about Eli Manning and, of course, his private equity firm wanting to own their own NFL team, as private equity might soon be allowed to start investing in that league. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
We now turn to basketball, the latest episode of The Deal with Alex Rodriguez and Jason Kelly, featuring A-Rod's Minnesota Timberwolves co-owner Marc Lore, with the Wolves battling in the NBA Western Conference Finals in the backdrop. Let's listen to a portion of the conversation between Jason, Alex, and Marc, starting with Marc talking about his natural drive to become an entrepreneur.
I have to say, though, I was born an entrepreneur. Yeah. When I was 4 years old, the teacher said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be a farmer." And she was like, "Farmer? Why farmer?" And I said, "Because they grow stuff from nothing." And that was sort of just the way I was sort of like born into the world. I loved the idea of growing stuff from nothing. As a kid, I didn't know anything other than, farmer, grow stuff from nothing. Didn't know about startups and things like that. My parents had me when they were 20 years old, so I spent a lot of time with my grandmother and grandfather. And so I came home. I was the first person in my family ever to go to college. So I came home with this crayon thing that said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And it said farmer. And I showed it to my grandmother, and she says, "Farmer? No. Doctor or lawyer?" And I said, no, farmer. And she was, wanting me to be, the first professional in the family. And so I did every entrepreneurial business you could imagine as a kid, car wash, newspaper route, recycling, baseball cards, lemonade stands, like anything you could think of, it did. And, just was born with this sort of, drive to want to work hard and build something.
That's Marc Lore on the latest edition of The Deal with Alex Rodriguez and Jason Kelly. You can listen to the full episode, plus listen back to all previous editions on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Coming up, we get more on the latest episode of The Deal with co-host and Bloomberg Originals chief correspondent Jason Kelly. You're listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports, Bloomberg Radio around the world.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio.
This is the Bloomberg Business of Sports show, where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Michael Barr, along with Scarlet and Damian Sassower. The latest episode of The Deal with Alex Rodriguez and Jason Kelly is out. It's featuring Marc Lore. Hey, first of all, he's the founder and CEO of Wonder and co-owner, along with A-Rod, of the Minnesota Timberwolves. And we've got our old buddy, old pal, old friend of the show, Bloomberg Originals chief correspondent Jason Kelly, here to take us behind the scenes of the episode.
How are y'all doing? Speaking to you from London. I hear it's nice in New York, so jealous of that.
Oh, yeah. Well, bring me back a magnet, will you?
Absolutely. Whatever you need.
Jason, you've got the man, Marc Lore. Can you take us through your new episode?
I mean, it's an interesting episode for us because, this is the first time, or probably the only time that we were going to have on The Deal, one of Alex's real, honest to goodness business partners. This is a guy who he's invested with over, a number of deals, most notably, they are co-owners of a minority stake in the Minnesota Timberwolves and Minnesota Lynx. And Marc himself has a fascinating journey as an entrepreneur. And so it was cool because Alex knows so much of this story. And so it was fun to sort of draw some of that out of Marc, but also, shamelessly leverage my co-host for some good intel.
That must have been a really interesting dynamic to watch, because you could just kind of throw a topic out there and let them debate it, deliberate on it, or just joust over it. You had mentioned that, of course, they are minority owners in the Timberwolves. At one point, they tried to buy the New York Mets. Did they talk about that at all?
They did. I mean, and that was actually, I mean, really how they got to know each other, Scar. And I think that process, and, you know, ultimately losing, obviously, to Steve Cohen, who is now the owner of the Mets, gave them a huge amount of conviction on something that you guys know very well, and we talk about all the time on our show and on yours, which is, you know, how important and candidly how valuable sports are in the broader culture, but the economics are, you know, continuing to grow, whether it's through media rights, sponsorships, et cetera. And so I think when they, you know, doing the work rather on the Mets really teed them up, as it were, when the Timberwolves came up for sale to do that deal, and they've been super excited about it. And, you know, let's not forget, I mean, Timberwolves are doing really well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're in the conference finals, you know, which is the furthest they've ever gone in the NBA playoffs, and the first time they've been there, I believe, since 2000.
Jason, as you know, I am just a voyeur when it comes to the business of sports. My real job here at Bloomberg is I'm the chief emerging market fixed income strategist, and I'm wondering if you asked Marc about his time at Credit Suisse First Boston back in the 90s when he was a vice president in emerging markets risk management. And I also would want to ask you, because you remember the late 90s, we had a financial crisis we had to deal with, the long-term capital management. Did you know that Scarlet, Marc started the Global Association for Risk, you know, the FRM, the Financial Risk Manager designation, like the CFA?
Yeah.
That's Marc. Marc
he started it.
Really? Did you talk about that at all?
We did. I'm so glad you brought that up, Damian, because we did talk a lot about that, because that experience, both, you know, creating the FRM, which he basically just like came up with the idea with the money.
Amazing.
And then just like put it together, you know.
Because he studied 3 years for a CFA, right? I mean, he got a CFA. He's like, this is a gimmick. Right. Let's do another one. It's amazing. It's unbelievable.
He really, he saw that there was like this need in the market. He saw that candidly it was a good business opportunity. I mean, the point about working on Wall Street is he hated it. Like, I mean, he really didn't like it.
Welcome to the club.
And he, you know, really took stock of his life, and, you know, was making, I think he said in the episode, $500,000 a year at a very young age. He had been super successful, and he was like, I don't want to do this anymore. And, you know, went out and really scratched that entrepreneurial itch to the point where he sold very successfully 3 companies, you know, culminating in the sale of Jet.com to Walmart for about $3.3 billion.
I got to bring this up, and I know I'm going a little bit off track. You wait, because I got something that I did with this. Good grief, Charlie Brown. I wish I could be there. You're going to Monaco, man.
I am. I mean, Formula One is, I would argue, guys, like one of the most fascinating kind of business sports culture stories of our time. Monaco was obviously sort of the granddaddy of them all when it comes to racing. What I'm really interested to see is I'm actually going to be spending some time when I'm there with a big entourage, for lack of a better term, from the Las Vegas Grand Prix. They're going to be there, you know, talking to sponsors, talking to teams and all of that. I have a sneaking suspicion that Las Vegas, which is going into its 2nd year, so it is literally the youngest of the Grands Prix. They really want to be the next Monaco. They see themselves as the future of F1, and you guys will find this interesting if you don't know it already. Las Vegas is also super interesting because Liberty Media, which owns Formula One, is actually the promoter of that race. So they have a lot of skin in the game, to use some, you know, Vegas and gambling terminology. So the sort of these two worlds colliding, I think, will be really interesting. But I'm sheepishly conceding and admitting, Michael Barr, that yes, I am going to Monaco.
Jason, I have to apologize for my colleague Michael Barr here. I mean, he's in a full sweat, but he was talking about the track earlier, and I have to apologize because I thought he was going to ask about Marc Lore on the track. You know, Marc Lore was the New Jersey state champ for the 55-meter dash, and He is fast, man. He beat Jerry Rice in a race for St. Jude Children's Hospital. I think he was second to Michael Vick in a 40-yard dash for with Ray Lewis and Rich Eisen's run. How fast is Marc Lore? Is it real? I mean, how big are his legs?
He's real. He is not a large man, but he can move for sure, just based on what you just described. I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I knew from meeting Marc a couple times, and obviously from Alex talking to him, talking about him a lot and their very close relationship and friendship. I mean, he's a total character. Like, if you made him up, nobody would believe you. And, what he has done as an entrepreneur is really interesting. He has this very interesting, almost like theory of business that he calls VCP, Vision Capital People, and he walked us through some of that and how he applies this to every company that he works on, how they're looking at the Timberwolves and Lynx through that lens. So I mean, he's a fascinating sort of thinker. He is not your typical, certainly not your typical Wall Street guy, probably not your typical team owner, and yeah, he does stuff like challenging people to 40-yard dashes, which, like, who does that?
Challenging very fast people to 40-yard dashes. Yes. Who does that?
Yeah, professional athletes.
Exactly. You mentioned VCP and his obsession with kind of putting his stamp on different companies. He's a serial entrepreneur. What does he want to do next? Obviously, it doesn't end with owning the Minnesota Timberwolves. Sure. And, he's got a couple of, I'm going to mix my metaphors here, but like pots on the stove, or, what's another metaphor that gets at the same idea?
Well, that's a good metaphor, because one of the big thing that he's working on right now is actually a food and restaurant related concept called Wonder, which is food delivery. They're trying to revolutionize that whole world. That's obviously a really difficult and competitive industry. We talked a little bit about his adventures there. Keep in mind, I mean, he's got the track record that definitely convinces people to bet on him. Diapers.com, which, I mean, sounds made up, right? It sounds like you're watching a rom-com. It's like, oh yeah, he started a company called Diapers.com. He actually did start a company called Diapers.com, sold it to Amazon. Amazon shut it down. As soon as they bought it, they essentially bought it to shut it down. He goes and starts Jet.com, and as I mentioned earlier, sells that to Walmart for $3.3 billion. But one of the things he said, and I wrote about this in summarizing the episode, was, he loves building things, and he loves, putting together a team. And one of the things he talked about in the moments after, really the days and weeks after selling Diapers.com to Amazon, is like how depressed he and the team were, despite making just a huge amount of money. He is just this like relentlessly restless guy who just likes to build stuff. So, I mean, definitely keep an eye on him. He's in his early 50s, so a lot of runway still left for him.
You talk to a guy like a Marc Lore, and I guess the bottom line is, what can the general person take away from a Marc Lore about learning about what it means to be an entrepreneur?
Yeah, I love that question, Barr. It's interesting. I got a text from a CEO shortly after the episode was released, saying, and he had listened to all the episodes of the deal. So thank you, CEO, for your listenership. But he said this was the one he actually took the most away from in terms of like practical advice. And I do think this whole notion, and listen, this is something very familiar to us at the company where we work, culture and people really matter. And like who you surround yourself with and a sense of mission, I think, is one thing that really came through so strongly in the conversations with Marc, and this idea of like spending so much time, and he talks about studying people's resumes and really understanding where they came from and really getting to know them through that process. There's a saying that I'm sure y'all have heard that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I think he's a deep believer in that. And so that was one thing that I think people will really take away from him is these very practical steps, that and it's interesting because it's practical steps that involve something that we all, I think, sometimes trick ourselves into thinking is soft or intangible. And in reality, it's at the core of everything. And so that was my big takeaway from him.
The Deal. with Jason Kelly and Alex Rodriguez. And the guest this week is Marc Lore. Thank you so much, Jason. You are always welcome to come on back, my man.
Thank you, guys. Always good to talk to you.
Our thanks to Jason Kelly for joining us. He's chief correspondent at Bloomberg Originals and co-host of The Deal, along with Alex Rodriguez and AKA Super Dude. Listen to the latest episode with Marc Lore and all the previous shows now on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcast. Up next, we turn to the college ranks and how close the NCAA is to a new revenue-sharing deal with its Power 5 conferences. You're listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio around the world.
You're listening to Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio.
This is the Bloomberg Business of Sports show, where we explore the big money issues in the world of sports. I'm Michael Barr, along with Scarlet and Damian Sassower. We've been watching big news in college sports. The NCAA could be on the brink of a new revenue-sharing deal with the Big 12, ACC, SEC, Pac-12, and Big 10, and a nearly $3 million fund for past athletes. It would mark the end of a legal battle involving the NCAA, and it could reshape college sports. And here to help us break it all down is friend of the show, Joe Moglia. He's former head football coach at Coastal Carolina, so he knows a thing or two about college football. Plus, he's the former chairman of the board and CEO at TD Ameritrade, so he knows a thing or two about money. Mr. Joe, welcome to the Bloomberg Business of Sports.
Hi, everybody. Scarlet, Damian, Michael. It's good to be back on.
Yay. Old friend of the show. See, I always love that. I want to just dive right into it because one of the big things we got, landmark revenue sharing deal for the players in the future, as well as a $2.7 billion fund for past athletes who have been seeking damage. This is all about the story with the NCAA and nearing a settlement agreement with top conferences. Can I get your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think like everything else, everything is pretty much driven by money the vast majority of the time. And I think this really does a decent job of at least initially addressing the money. So by agreeing to a $2.7 billion settlement, I think the reason why people are potentially agreeing with that or are agreeing with that is because they're trying to avoid a $20 billion liability down the road. So it addresses that for the time being. Now, it still does not address the appropriate structure and the process and the guardrails that are necessary, in effect, to be able to handle this as far as college athletics go. And it's still a major, major question as to what's good for Power 5 in football and men's basketball. Is that good for other sports? And is it good for anything else other than Power 5 football and men's basketball? And I think there are a lot of questions with regard to that. And it may serve the problem from a financial perspective near term, but it does not solve the overall challenge.
Okay, so everything but the Power 5, how do they move forward? How do they plan? Or how does the NCAA start to look at this?
Well, the NCAA has already said that all those things with regards to how they're going to handle the portal, how they're going to handle transfers, how they're going to handle contracts, how they're going to handle transparency, those details have not been worked out yet. And that's part of the issue that I think exists here. You come up with a solution that's driven by the courts, that's driven by a lawsuit that initially handles the money, but it does not handle the issue. It does not handle the problem with regard to college athletics. That's still a major issue.
Is there the impetus for the NCAA to figure this out, or is it just, we've solved the money part of it, so there's less of a priority put on the rest of the details?
Well, they'll not say, they won't say it that way, but I think that is the case. That as long as they satisfy Power 5 football, men's basketball, for the time being, they're going to feel okay. And I think there's still an obsession with making sure they do everything they can to keep Power 5 football within the auspices of the NCAA. I really do think that there is a bigger question here, a bigger dilemma. You want to spend a minute on that?
Please.
Okay, so I think we got to be. It's almost it's existentialism versus capitalism, and so if you go back from an existentialist perspective, why do universities exist? Period. then within that, why do universities have athletic programs? Okay. Now, we can come up with all the reasons for that, all the good reasons. The world of academia can come up with all the reasons for that. But now within that world, there is a very, very real piece that is absolutely 100% business. It's all about capitalism. And it's got nothing to do with academics. Mm-hmm. We don't even talk about eligibility anymore. So you have, in effect, you have the existentialist philosophy in terms of why university life exists with amateurism. And you have a real business that is now existing with regards to the payment of players, which is capitalism. So how do you handle this? I think there is a way to potentially handle this. And you have two major groups. One group's the professional group. Let's consider that the Power 5 schools, dominantly Division I and the revenue sports. Then you have the amateur group. Let's consider that the non-revenue sports and all of Division II and Division III. The professional group has to break away from the NCAA. They have to bring in their own executive team, and they have to model themselves at professional sports. Use the NFL as a guideline. If the NFL ran themselves the way college athletics is running themselves today, they'd go out of business. So use a model that actually works. You have collective bargaining, you have transparency, you have contracts, you can make it work. It's a business. It's a pure business, period. So, on the other side, yeah.
Sorry to cut you off. I mean, I think I get the point here. We haven't really agreed to how the transfer portal will be handled, how roster limits will be handled, how scholarship will. Basically, all this is designed to do is agree to a number, $2.7 billion, to get some of these antitrust suits off the NCAA's back so that they can begin to discuss some of these issues. I think that's what you're saying here. And so then I only have one question. Who decides how that $2.7 billion gets allocated to past athletes and as past student athletes? I mean, I got to believe some of the schools who don't have football programs got to be, pretty disappointed in how that. I mean, talk to us a little bit about that $2.7 billion. I mean, what's at stake here?
Well, I think first of all, I think all the non-Power 5 football schools, we're already complaining about this. Val Ackerman with the Big East, the commissioner of the Big East, has been very vocal in terms of this is very unfair to them because they don't have football, as an example. And the way they're supposed to distribute. Now, everything we're hearing, by the way, has been leaks. And there's been a lot of leaks on this over the span of the last month or so. But there hasn't been a leak with regards to, there was supposed to be a formula for, let's say, going back to 2016, how you would pay a swimmer versus how you might play a Power 5 football player in 2020. Clearly, they would be different numbers, but they have some sort of formula that they have not leaked, and we don't know what that looks like. So the devil would be in that details. But yeah, all those issues still need to be worked out, and the deal will only last to 2034. So in 2030, and by the way, it's interesting that happens to correspond with the end, I think, of the Big Ten television deal. So 2034, but in 2034, you open it up for more lawsuits. So it doesn't even protect them past 2034. It pushes that can down the road a little bit.
So then, Joe, this is an unfair question because you're right. We're just basing all of this on leaks and word of mouth here, but who's in? Like, in the current construct of this deal, this $2.7 billion deal, who has tentatively agreed to this as it stands?
Power 5 schools and Power 5 conferences. And because they're concerned that, again, especially in football, men's basketball, that they're worried about a $20 billion liability. So when you talk about the potential number in terms of going back and taking care of athletes going back to 2016, the potential number there that is put on the table. But again, we don't know how valid these numbers are. Somebody's kind of pulling them out of thin air, I think. It's $20 billion. So for Power 5 to think, you know what, we're happy to settle for 2.7 because we don't want to go anywhere near 20 billion. And rather than risk that, we'll go with a 2.7. But that's only going to last till 2034. Right. That's why they're happy with that. All the other schools are represented by the NCAA. So in effect, the other schools really don't have a vote. Right. The NCAA has their proxy.
Okay, so Joe, you are a longtime coach. You deal with young people. You work and talk to their families. What if you're a young athlete and you're being recruited to play sports in school, and you have a choice between going to a Power 5 school or not, or playing football or another sport? How would you advise them? How do they think through this? Because this is going to be their next couple of years. They can't wait until 2034.
Well, no, they can't. Well, I think that already exists, Scarlet. Okay, so number one, it used to be, what is the right school for me as an individual student athlete? Where am I going to get the best education? What am I interested in terms of a major? What do I think about life after football? I may get to the NFL, but chances are I'm not. So what am I interested in as far as that goes? That was always the big question that you wanted a high school student or a transfer student to be able to answer. Now, the first or second thing out of a student athlete's mouth is being recruited, whether he's coming in, he or she's coming in off the portal, or whether they're coming in from high school or from the parents, is what kind of NIL deal would I be able to get? That's the first thing out of their mouths. So you can talk about how great the university is, and you can talk about what a wonderful experience it's going to be, and what great facilities we have, and what great tradition. But what's going to drive this is how much money I'm going to get.
So, Joe, if the Big Five conference, if they support this, the Power Five, if they support this 2.7, what's to stop it? I mean, what comes next? What's the timeline here? I mean, what can we expect? Are they going to then have to sit down with, all of the universities that are represented by the NCAA to figure out how the money's allocated, figure out, roster sizes, roster limits, transfer portals, all this stuff? And I guess my question is, how long is that going to take?
Well, they're talking about 6 months, but they haven't addressed any of that so far in the last 3+ years. Right, but they will eventually address that. But the Power Five simply won't worry about any of the other conferences. They will say they do, but they will not. So Power Five will do whatever's in their best interest. The NCAA is going to allow them to do that because they don't want to see the Power Five break away from the NCAA. So the Power Five will do what they need to do for themselves, and everybody else is going to have to fend for themselves. That's what I meant in the very, very beginning, folks, that this does not solve the ultimate issue. Mm-hmm. The ultimate issue is you have this literally existentialist versus capitalism dilemma between what's going on in university life and athletics. And there are 567,000 college athletes that exist today, about ballpark. Okay, probably maybe 1% of them, that's 5,000, 6,000 and change, get more than $10,000 a year. 1%. So you got 99%, or at least conservatively 95% of all college athletes are not going to get a penny. They're not going to get any money, or they're going to get somebody who's going to want to be a nominal. That's why there's got to be a major divide between what's got to be looked at as professional, for the time being, just call it Division I, and amateur, let's call that Division II, Division III. So if you're good enough to get paid, that means they'll recruit you from Division II to Division I. Similar to what would happen in the soccer league, the Premier League in Europe. You have the best teams, and then you have kind of the ones that are doing real well on a particular year or two. They could get invited up. Well, an individual can get invited up to Division I or the professional group, right, by being recruited by that group. It would work.
Joe Moglia, former chairman of the board and CEO of TD Ameritrade. By the way, he's coach to me because he's the former head football coach at Coastal Carolina University. Joe, thank you, sir, for joining us on the Bloomberg Business of Sports, and thank you for dropping your knowledge on us. We really do appreciate it.
Folks, I'm grateful for you having me on. All the best.
Now, if you missed anything, go back and listen to the whole thing on demand on the Bloomberg Business of Sports podcast. It's available on Apple, Spotify, and all your favorite podcast platforms. Thank you for listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports show. We're here each and every week at the same time. For my colleagues Scarlet and Damian Sassower, I'm Michael Barr. Tune in again next week for the latest on the stories moving big money in the world of sports. You're listening to the Bloomberg Business of Sports from Bloomberg Radio around the world. Stay with us. Today's top stories and global business headlines are coming up right now.